Welcome everyone to today's webcast on AI as a service. We'll start with a quick agenda as far as what we're going to cover today. I'll do a quick intro, then I'll move into an overview of AI as a service offerings. So what do they look like? How can we define them? Where are some different areas within our organization in which we may be able to play these offerings? And from there, we'll move into seeing AI as a service offerings in action, so a hands-on use case. And finally, we'll wrap up with some considerations around driving value using AI as a service offerings within our organizations. So I mentioned quick introduction. My name is Scott Stieritz. I'm a BI and analytics consultant with Thorogood. I've worked in a number of technologies across a number of industries, but I find AI as a whole really interesting, which is why I'm excited to talk about some of the AI as a service offerings that we've seen today. So it was a very quick introduction to myself, to Thorogood, and from there, I'll go into an overview of AI as a service. So before we try to get to a super specific definition or like a formal definition of what it is, I feel like it might help to see a couple examples and kind of get everyone on the same page as far as what we're discussing here. So AI as a service offerings are integrated into a number of different cloud platforms that we've seen, like Google Cloud through Google Cloud AI, AWS AI services, Microsoft's Azure Cognitive Services, IBM Watson, and more beyond that. And they cover a variety of application areas. So there are some some general use cases that focus on things like natural language processing or computer vision and many more. There are also some industry-specific solutions. So some of the vendors have created solutions focusing on medical use cases, like AI as a service offerings that can interpret medical documentation, or in the manufacturing sector where it can interpret and process data being passed from IoT sensors on machines in a manufacturing environment, something to that effect. So we can also see through many of these vendors some examples of what these look like. So vendors will often put out like some demos that you can play around, which are pretty fun to play around with if you're interested to do so. For example, AWS has this demo website set up to highlight some of its AI as a service offerings. Maybe one that we want to take a look at today is Amazon Comprehend. It's a natural language processing offering which will read text, and it will give us some information about sentiment analysis within that text, any objects or like entities detected within the text, and much more. So maybe I'll first start by just typing "Welcome to the AI as a Service webcast," and we'll just see what it has to say about that. I clicked Analyze Text with Comprehend, and I can see that for the most part, it's interpreting this to be a pretty neutral statement, which is the case. It's pretty neutral. It's just saying, "Welcome to this webcast." I can also get some more information about different words within this text that I've entered, how they're being used, those sorts of things. Or maybe if I want to go into see a little bit more, I could add to this something to the effect of, "Welcome to the webcast. I'm glad you've joined. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me at my email, blah, blah, blah." And I'll analyze that. And we can see that, by adding some more positive words, by maybe changing around some punctuation that I've used, it's updated this from saying, "Hey, this is a neutral statement," to being something, "This is a pretty heavily positive statement." And so it's interesting how it can very quickly interpret entered text. Again, we can get more information about how words are being used. And something that's super interesting in my mind is it can pick up PII that's included within that information. So it can pick up like my email, my work email, which was included in there with a pretty high confidence. It's saying, "Hey, here's a piece of PII. It is an email. This is exactly the character at which it begins and the character at which it ends." So if I wanted to, I could go back through and maybe parse that out or keep that out from a data set if I wanted to do some advanced analytics on there. So again, very, very quick look at what that looks like. And now that we've kind of seen some of these things in action, why don't we talk about maybe a little bit more of a formal definition around what this offering is really bringing us. So let's start with what is artificial intelligence as a whole. It's the application of computer science to the simulation of rational or intelligent behavior in machines. And some people will kind of describe this as trying to get computers to act like humans or make decisions like humans, and often covering the areas of communication, speech, and language comprehension, visual perception, search, and a number of use cases beyond that. But why is AI valuable within our organization? It's really through the automation of this rational decision making that we're talking about, which can bring us a few things. First of all, let's say we have people that are reviewing documents that have some manual, like they have handwriting on them and just doing some data entry. Well, rather than having our people focus on that, instead we could automate that activity of just parsing documents and doing data entry of the information found within those documents, and reserve our people's time for more specialized, maybe more high value add activities where we do want that human input. It can also offer us some consistency. So, if we have a number of different people doing the same process, making the same decisions, they might have different thresholds for where they make one decision versus another. Whereas if we're able to automate that process, we can kind of make sure that there's more consistency within that decision making, and make sure that things are kind of acted upon the same way each time. Final point that AI and AI as a service can bring us is scalability. So this one might be a little bit self-explanatory, but you could imagine it's quite a bit easier to scale some of the underlying components beneath a solution that incorporates an AI as a service offering than it is to, say, scale our staffing tenfold or 100-fold or however big we need to get if we had humans working on those activities. So then AI as a service offerings is basically packaging up this AI and providing it to us, from those AI as a service vendors as, I guess, as the name says, as a service, as something that we can consume through APIs, through SDKs, embed in our applications, those sorts of things. So to that point, where can this service fit into our organization? And one area in which kind of sticks out to me is the assessment of business value. So let's say we're doing some exploratory analytics. We have an interesting business question, and we want to figure out is this something we can get to the answer of, and if we do, is that something that's going to be valuable to our business? But the challenge is, how can we figure out if the output is valuable until we have something that's representative of the output? But we also don't want to invest huge amounts of time in getting to that output if it's not something that's going to be hugely valuable in the first place. So we could take an AI as a service offering, maybe something that's a little bit more out of the box, but is still representative of the solution that we're trying to get to, and plug it into our workflow a little bit in order to serve maybe as an initial POC, assess value up front, get some feedback on it, and figure out, is this a stream of effort that we want to pursue, and maybe do some more custom model development on top of that. And to that point, AI as a service can also fit in terms of model performance benchmarking. So let's say we say, yes, this is an area that's worth pursuing. We do want to do some custom development of our own model to solve this solution. So we do some development, and we decide, or we want to know, how well is this custom model performing? Like, what do we have to compare it against? And in that case, it's very helpful to take one of these AI as a service offerings and kind of plug it in as, here's, again, a bit more of an out-of-the-box solution. Here's something that we haven't customized quite as much. Here's our more custom development. Are we seeing enough incremental value in that custom development that it's worth all that incremental effort of customizing it? Do we want to continue, and do we want to go farther? Another area might be a little bit farther upstream from that model development. So things like feature engineering and data labeling. We can we could think about maybe the sentiment analysis example that we saw just a couple minutes ago. Let's say we're running social media campaigns and we want to analyze the effectiveness of those campaigns, like advertising campaigns on social media. So we could take just the purely factual social media information, what we've posted, what people have said in response to it through those social media platforms. But what if we could further enrich it with some more attribution, like sentiment analysis on what people have said? So not just what have they said, but is it something positive? Is it something negative in terms of their reaction to our campaign? So using these for data enrichment, and then that enriched data can be used further downstream in another model or in another analysis. Finally, an area where AI as a service can also fit in is through direct integration into applications. So maybe we're not as focused on developing a custom model or doing some exploratory analytics. Maybe there's a specific offering that's functionality that right now we want to get into an application, like a translation service, which is a common AI as a service offering available across many platforms. Maybe we want language translation to just plug into our application. And in that case, we can make use of the as a service offerings like APIs or SDKs to just inject it directly into our productionized application to make it a bit more intelligent. So as far as understanding how these things work, it's probably best to picture what an advanced analytics workflow might look like without an AI as a service offering. So we would start with some sort of training data. Maybe it's historical data within our organization, just representative of whatever business process we're trying to model, and a model algorithm. So not the trained model, not customized to our specific use case, but just the selection of the model of here's the outline that we would like to use. And then we bring those together in order to get a trained model. And there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes here, like model selection and model evaluation and feature selection, quite an iterative process behind the scenes. But for the sake of simplicity, I've just kept only a few things on the screen here. And then we might take live data. So if we trained this on historical data within our organization, we might have updated data that comes in on an ongoing basis that we are interested to predict out. So we can take that live data and pass it through our trained model in order to predict out whatever output we're trying to get to. And if we want to think about AI as a service offerings, how they're differentiated within or across offerings, it's useful to look at this relationship, at where that training data is coming from, how it gets to the trained model, and ultimately the insights get to us from there. So let's start with one instance in which the provider of the AI as a service offering is providing all of the training data. So it could be a combination of public data, maybe some proprietary data that they have, or third-party data, whatever data they're using, and they create the trained model. So this is all kind of packaged up within the AI as a service offering, and then it's surfaced to us for model consumption, again, through APIs, through SDKs, so we can integrate those into our applications. And we can kind of consider this an out-of-the-box model. We're not providing the initial data. We're just consuming this trained model or the outputs of this trained model that's provided to us, and the provider or the vendor has managed everything as far as the data and the training of the model, which is good in terms of we're not responsible for the data, but maybe on the other hand, we want something that's very specific to our own use case. So let's say we have our own organizational data, and that can get passed to a trained model. So maybe in the instance of a forecasting AI as a service offering, where public information or other data sets are not that helpful, it's really the information that we're trying to forecast in our own organizational data that's the key input here. So our information can be passed in. There's some processing of our data and training of the model, and the results are surfaced for us to consume. And we can consider this like proprietary retraining, in which we're responsible for passing the data in the first place. And the proprietary aspect of it, the proprietary aspect of the AI as a service offering, is how that data is brought in, how a model is built on top of that, how the outputs are brought out from that model, and then those outputs are surfaced to us to consume, again, through APIs, SDKs, whatever. So So again, a benefit in terms of having some more customization and it being very specific to our use case. But the drawback is we're now responsible for making sure we have a sufficient amount of training information or training data in order to get to a good model and get good results. And then something that kind of is a blend of the two and helps fill some of those gaps starts by looking very similar to one of those out-of-the-box models. There's provider data that's going into a trained model or maybe a partially trained model. Then we can take some organizational data and combine it with information or learnings from that trained model in order to create a further refined model. And this whole process all happens within the AI as a service offering. It does that partial training, it brings in your own organizational data, and it does that refinement of the model again for to be exposed for consumption. And we can call this transfer learning because there's some level of initial learning. Say we're thinking about like a computer vision use case in which most of the computer vision functionality or like object detection is already learned and like patterns for identifying more general objects are already learned. And then say we want to identify our specific product in images or our specific brand, we could layer in that additional information with a number of images of that product so that it's combined with that more general functionality in order to create a model that's not only good at general object detection, but also object detection of the objects that we're super interested in. So more refinement to focus on our specific use case. So that was a pretty rapid overview, I would think. From there, let's see some of these things in action. So going beyond just the high level demo, going beyond the explanation, let's see a hands-on use case of how we can make use of AI as a service offerings. So maybe I'll first start with an explanation of the use case, and I can bring this up on the screen here of just a receipt. So a parking garage receipt. Let's say I work within the finance department of my organization, and I have a team that's tasked with collecting expenses. We have expenses that are submitted and associated receipts, and every period we need to go through each of these receipts and make sure that they match up with the submitted expense in order to reimburse or whatever the downstream process is. So these are a number of my own actual receipts that I've just had laying around in various places that I've just taken some photos of. So you can see not the highest quality photo here. There's some missing information, but some actual receipts that I've taken. So what if we can use AI as a service offerings to automate this process? And that's what I've built out here is an approach to automating the process through these offerings. So I've built this out in Google Cloud. So within cloud storage, I have a bucket for this specific process. 3 folders within that bucket. One's this input folder where I can just drop my receipts to be processed. One being an output folder where I'll get the results after they're processed, and then an archive just for capturing the raw data once that processing is complete. So as far as the actual activity that sits on top of this, there's Vertex AI, which is Google Cloud's kind of end-to-end machine learning advanced analytics offering. Within there, there's the Vertex AI Workbench, which offers notebook functionality. So I've built out this kind of application within notebooks in there, which we'll take a look at. But maybe first I'll start this by just going into that input folder, grabbing these 3 receipts, and just dropping them into the folder here. I'll give it a second to upload, and in the meantime, yeah, they're already in there. In the meantime, we can take a look at the notebooks here. So here is the application that I've built out, this expense processor, which, as the description says, extracts expense information from receipts that are in Google Cloud Storage in that specific bucket. It stores the expense details post-processing, again, back in cloud storage, and it will print out to me a summary of all the expenses that I've submitted. And I can run this stuff live on the webcast here. So I'll start with just setting some configuration information, setting details about where my input receipts lie, where I want the output to go post-processing, where I want the data to be archived after it's been processed. Then I've defined this function, process expenses, which just takes in that input information and submits it to Document AI, which is Google's AI as a service offering for document processing, to manipulate those receipts to try to extract the information from them. So I can see picked up 3 receipts here, one from a discount department store, one from an electronics store, and one from a parking garage, and it's submitted them to Document AI for processing. And while that runs, Document AI, like I said, is Google's offering for parsing through document data, reading forms, reading specific types of forms, reading expenses, all those sorts of things. There is a demo online if you're interested to just play around with it at a high level. But as far as the actual integration of this, I have another notebook notebook here within my config folder just called functions, where I've defined out all the different functions that I'm using, like this process expenses one, which might look like a lot, but if we really simplified this down, the activities that I'm doing in here are just connecting to the Document AI service, which is this line right here. So I'm setting up that connection to the AI as a service offering. I'm also connecting to cloud storage, like defining the bucket that I'm connecting to. I'm doing some preparation, like preparing the input request, preparing where I want the data to go, based on some of that configuration information after it's processed. But then the real bulk of this is kind of one line. So it's not too complicated, I would say, in that there's one function that allows us to pass that request with all the input and output details to Document AI for processing, and then we can get the results. And I can see that it looks like this is completed. We've archived those 3 expenses at this point, and I've also set up some other functions that allow me to get the results of that processing. So I've now ingested that information, and I am pulling out the expense totals, and I can see that $277.50 is what was spent at that discount department store, or $10.72 at the electronics store, or $10 at the parking garage. And if I want to go back to the actual receipts, I can see that this matches the actual total numbers that came in from those ingested receipts, which is pretty interesting. But we can also think about this use case beyond just that one example. So, if we're thinking about like document processing, this could also apply to, say, a insurance company that's looking to process insurance claims and extract information from those documents, or a medical R&D company that's looking to parse through medical information for some further data and analytics on that. Some considerations around driving value using AI as a service offerings within our organization. So one that I think is a pretty interesting thing to think about is competitive advantage. So maybe back in another approach, if we're thinking about like developing custom models, then some of our differentiation for our organization versus competitors could come in the specific models that we've actually come up with. But when we're thinking about AI as a service offerings, where everyone has access to the same algorithms, where can we find that competitive advantage? How can we find points of differentiation? And this comes from basically a focus on the processes surrounding that AI as a service offering. So things upstream, like our data architecture, data governance practices, data engineering, to make sure that we have good data and valuable data to feed into these AI as a service offerings, and also how effectively can we work downstream of the outputs of the AI as a service offering. So grabbing the results, incorporating the results into other data sets, bringing them into front-end applications for consumption, lots of things like that. Another kind of important consideration is how effectively, once we have the information in some downstream applications, how effectively, or maybe more so, how willing are we to act upon that information? So we can think about change management, meaning like, how do we get people in our organization to start trusting insights from these services? Well, we can build trust and buy-in in a number of different areas. One of these is through humans in the loop process, which allows low confidence results from an AI as a service offering to be passed to a real person, say like a real person in our finance department, if it's not sure about the information within a receipt, for human processing to like check, or for some ongoing validation. So just some random sampling of results compared against human results to kind of build some confidence there. We could also provide context around the insights through maybe some more traditional reporting and analytics also integrated into an application, and also monitor our outputs for accuracy and ongoing performance. And speaking of thinking about those outputs, kind of a final consideration to bring up here is around ethical AI. So how can we ensure that we kind of keep sight of our own values and our organizational values while we're applying AI? And it's important to identify any potential ethical considerations that might come up within the business case. We also want to think about what data we're feeding into these AI as a service offerings to evaluate them for fairness. And in addition to monitoring outputs for accuracy and for performance, we also want to monitor our outputs for any indications of bias. Like I said, that's all I was hoping to get to today. So thank you very much for joining. My contact information is on the screen, so feel free to grab that and reach out if you have any questions or comments following the event. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.